Hi, and welcome to the third instalment of the Psych Health and Safety's podcast live events. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the regular podcast. I'll introduce all the panelists in a moment, but first let me introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Hi, Jason. Exciting times in my house. We've got a birthday party coming up on the weekend, so it's all sales. I've just lost my...
That's great. It's a good thing we're not doing a live panel at the moment.
It is. It would be embarrassing.
Yeah.
Full steam ahead. That's the phrase.
How old's Ronan turning?
8.
8, yeah.
Yes, so we're having a mini golf party.
Ah, fantastic. And have you finished making the cake yet?
I will be making the cake on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had some delivery dramas with a Lego set that I'd planned to use for the cake topper. So I've had to do some contacting of cake makers to see if they can make me a fondant version of what I was after. And very fortunately, I've found someone who can do it for me.
Oh, fantastic. I've always found that's probably something good to outsource rather than try and do it myself.
Yeah, trying to create a fondant ender dragon, I think, is probably outside of my particular skill set.
Well, we didn't employ you for that. So.
No.
Well, great to have you on. I want to now introduce our next two panelists from episode 20 of the Psych Health and Safety podcast, and from University of Tasmania and Pracademia, Angela Martin. Welcome.
Hi. Good to be with you.
And Adam Nebbs, who also is from UTAS
Hello.
and works closely with Angela as a PhD candidate.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, listeners of the regular podcast will know Angela, no doubt. But Adam, you are a newbie to the Psych Health and Safety podcast. We've had a number of chats ourselves over Zoom, so I feel like I know you really well, even though we've never met because of this pandemic. But maybe you can let listeners know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing my PhD for 11 months now. I just passed my confirmation about a month ago, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a significant milestone in the life of a PhD where the university can decide whether you continue or not. So I've been given the green light for that, which is good. But yeah, as I'll talk about a bit more, I suppose, in the context of why I started looking at workplace mental health, I previously worked in the banking industry for the past 10 years. So a bit of a switch back to research, just getting my academic brain back online, which has taken a long time, but we're getting there.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll ask you in a moment about what got you interested in workplace mental health, coming from a banking context of all places. But just to let the listeners know, the way that the format's going to run is the same as the last two live events that we've run, and that is that we'll spend about 60 minutes having a bit of a fireside chat between the four of us. This time the topic is obviously around psychosocial risk management, current and future practice, and then we'll open it up for a live Q&A. So if you're having any questions in the first hour, feel free to drop it in the YouTube chat. Just be aware, even though this is live streaming to LinkedIn at the same time, it will only be the YouTube comments that we'll be looking at and posting up questions from. So head over to YouTube if you're not there already. But what I'd love to do, Adam, is to find out, I guess, a little bit more about your background. I mean, this is a topic, obviously, that you should be fully over, given that your PhD has largely focused on psychosocial risk assessment, and that's obviously why we've invited you on today. But coming from a banking background, what got you interested in workplace mental health to begin with?
It's a good question, because it's been quite a big transition. But as I said, I've worked in the banking industry for the past 10 years, most of that time as a frontline manager. So I worked in a contact center as a manager there and in a branch. So incredibly stressful environments. But really, the reason why I got into the topic of workplace mental health was my lived experience over those 10 years. So I had quite a few big stresses into my life. So I lost my best friend to suicide, unfortunately. I had a marriage breakdown. So a lot of big things that caused a lot of anxiety over that time. But the big standout for me was just how my employers at the time handled those situations. They were just very ill-equipped to deal with it. And I think it was just due to a lot of factors, and ignorance as to how to handle people with mental health issues. No kind of management directives around how to handle somebody who's struggling from something like that. but also just no clear strategy, you know, around how to assess and control psychosocial hazards, which we'll talk a bit more about later. But that was the defining thing for me. I just thought, you know, I was lucky enough to have some amazing social support around me at the time. But I couldn't get out of my head, you know, the working domain is one where we spend most of our waking hours. Yet this domain seems to be, you know, where things aren't handled as well as they could. So I just thought I really want to go back to research and see how I can obviously bring about positive change. And that led me to meet Ange, and here I am today. So it's been a really nice change.
So can you tell us a bit more then how you actually came to meet Angela and sort of decide to proceed on this PhD?
Yeah, so before I resigned, I kind of decided to go on LinkedIn, as you do, and just start connecting with some people. And Ange was one of those amazing people that responded to me. There wasn't a lot of people that responded to me, but she gave me a lot of time of day, which was really awesome because we'd never met before. And we had a couple of catch-ups where I was able to talk about what I was interested in, what my experience was, particularly from a research perspective. And at that time, you know, Ange was looking for a PhD student to help with a Tasmanian population study. And so I applied for that and was lucky enough to get it after having a 10-year hiatus from academia. So I feel very blessed because not just because Angela's on the call right now, but she's just the best supervisor I could ever ask for. So I feel very lucky.
Oh, lovely.
So what was the initial focus of the PhD project then? It sounds like it might have morphed a little bit since then.
Well, I might throw that one to Ange, actually. Yeah.
Well, they all morph. They definitely morph. And there's been a move, I guess, in the last 5 years or so in academia to actually advertise specific projects that you're looking for people to come and work with you on, rather than the older model, which was, you know, the candidate came with the idea and you helped them work it up into a research proposal. So I had a project up on our website looking for people interested in workplace mental health. And as Adam said, in particular, what I wanted to do was do a study that would help to inform the development of a statewide strategic approach to workplace mental health, because a lot of the safe work bodies in other states have started their own big strategies. So I'd seen what New South Wales was doing. They've been doing a lot, and also Victoria had the Work Well initiative. And I thought, well, we really need something here in Tasmania, but I, you know, want to make sure it's evidence informed rather than just starting and saying, you know, with stakeholders what should be in it. So the title of the project that I advertised that Adam responded to was what's the state of play in Tasmania in workplace mental health? And there we were looking not just at psychosocial risk assessment and mitigation and management practices, but also the other parts of workplace mental health. You know, the reason Adam got into it in the first place is more that, you know, how should employers respond when issues are and that they might be struggling. So we really, at the university, were thinking about a study that would sort of map what is the current practice across industry, something really representative that helps us to know how much this is on the radar for employers, what they're actually doing, maybe where some of the leaders in particular industries are that can help bring the rest of their industry along. And so that was what it was called, the state of play in Tasmanian workplace mental health, informing a strategic approach. And so we're working with WorkSafe Tasmania on that. So that's what it looked like. But the morphing, as you said, once you get down to the nuts and bolts of things and start looking into the literature, we thought, okay, so what we need is obviously to do a population survey, started looking at survey tools and went, oh my God, there's so many different measures and things out there. And that's what Adam ended up sort of redesigning the first study to be actually about a review of all those different approaches to measurement under that broad banner of workplace mental health. So that's what he's been doing at the moment. And then we'll be, obviously I'm trying to get funding. I'm trying to get money for this big survey. So I'm speaking with different government departments at the moment, so that we can be set up to run a big survey when that funding comes through. And being an optimist, I know it will.
Yeah, it seems like one of the more popular ways to be able to get yourself published is developing a survey, isn't it?
Definitely high citation on measures, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll get more into psychosocial risk management, risk assessment in a moment, because that's obviously what we want to focus this session on. But Adam, over to you again. What got you interested in psychosocial risk management?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, one of the big things, as I said before, during my time in the banking industry, I couldn't really see any visible attempts to, formulate a strategy or start to try and assess and control psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And I think that's just because a lot of businesses, even big business, just don't know how to do that. So, early in the PhD, as you do, the first question I really had was, okay, so what businesses are doing it best? And I was quite lucky in the first month of my PhD, I connected with Marianne Baton, who gave me some of her time, and we had a chat, and I asked her the question, what is the business that's doing this the best? Expecting she'd, list off a whole bunch of companies, and I contact them and, easy. No, the answer was, look, no business is getting it 100% right. Every business has opportunities. And what I liked was she said, look, I could probably tell you some businesses that are doing it well right now, but they may not be after some significant changes. And I mean, look at COVID and things like that. Not every business is going to have a stable environment. It's constantly going to go through change. So, what I learned quite early on was that the best businesses are the ones that have a really strong strategy. And a lot of that's to do with, doing psychosocial risk assessment to understand your stresses, and you've got to keep doing that. It's not like you can do a one-off survey and the findings of that will inform your strategy forever. It's going to constantly be something that you need to change. So that's really cemented for me that, our project needed to start with psychosocial risk assessment and setting businesses up for that.
Yeah, because it would have been very easy to find a company that is doing something around workplace mental health, right? Because it could be we have an EAP available for employees who are distressed, or we have a mindfulness app that we're making available. We have resilience or stress management training. There's a lot of things that fall under the banner of workplace mental health, clearly. But risk management of psychosocial hazards is something that, as Marianne pointed out, who's a good friend of our show, it's not something that's commonplace, so it's hard to find good examples of that. And I think, in fact, Joelle has to give a presentation tomorrow and has been asked the same thing. Give us some examples of who's doing this well, and it's very hard to find good examples.
They were asking specific examples, which is even more difficult.
And I think it's a pretty standard thing that, whether it's an intervention, whether it's a tool, whether it's a business, there's always that question of who's doing it the best. I think we're just programmed to ask that question because we want to just emulate that practice. But I think ultimately it's a much more complex question. And the more you look into the literature, even if it's at, interventions, there is no one size fits all approach. You've really got to know your business, and you'll do that through effective psychosocial risk management, really. So.
And that's, I guess, really what Clause 4 of the standard is all about, the context of the organisation and understanding the context, because that, that forms the foundation of everything else that you do.
I just want to say as well that risk assessment and mitigation management, there's lots of complicated language around this area. But for me, what interests me the most is there's such a significant opportunity for prevention of mental health disorder by doing this, with it, the workplace being pretty much our major social context outside of our family and friends. There is so much opportunity, and even just looking at one psychosocial risk, some of you might be familiar with a paper by some of my colleagues, Tony LaMontagne, Fiona Cocker and Christy Sanderson, where they modelled that 10 to 15% of the incidence of depression could be controlled by good job control. So just that one factor, explaining 10 to 15% of variance in depression, there's a huge impact that can be gained for the population mental health by actually trying to enhance job control.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Angela. I was just off a conversation with someone from the UK just before this, actually. It was really bad timing. But we were talking about how stress is cumulative, right? Stress comes from individual circumstances. So that might be the fact that you've got, financial burden, like you shared your personal story, Adam, some of the personal things that were going on in your life. Then you have macro events like living through a pandemic and economic instability. And then you have the workplace factors, right? That can also impact workload, autonomy, control, all these sorts of things. Now, an employer can't control, that someone's, having financial difficulties or their marriage is breaking up. They can't control the fact that there's a global pandemic going on. What they can control, as you're saying, Angela, are some of these workplace factors. So it's not their job to control everything else, but the things that are within their control, they're definitely the things that they should be risk assessing and finding these ways to continuously improve.
And they can also work with their employees who are struggling due to issues outside of work and find solutions to support those employees to keep them in work in whatever ways possible.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So Angela, we're using this term psychosocial risk assessment, and for those of our viewers or listeners who might not be across the lingo, can you give us a bit of a definition?
Yeah, sure. So I always start, in fact, I gave a presentation just last week, and I always start with the real basics before I go into it, because you're assuming that people even know what the word psychosocial means. And most people in the general population don't. They're not familiar with that. We use these words and know what they mean, but so always got to start with the basics. There's two parts to the word, psycho and social. Obviously, the social is anything in our environment that we respond to in a psychological way, so with our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. So it's that interface between our social environment and our own personal psychology, if you like. And so many factors obviously can affect how we perceive our working conditions. Both of the sort of more objective or hard working conditions, like, our rates of pay and these sort of things, to the softer, more perceptual based conditions socially, and those other kinds of factors that are in any guide that you pick up on psychosocial risk assessment. So that's what psychosocial is. I guess then thinking about the legal duty to assess and control, there's lots of different things that sit under that as well. I guess that's what the focus of tonight's chat is about, is ways of assessing and also then the flow on ways of controlling those risks. But, just going back in time to some of the foundational studies in the area in the 70s, they were able to prospectively track people who were employed and look at who developed mental health conditions and who didn't. And that's how we started to know what some of those factors or exposures were. And over time, over the last 20, 30 years, we've developed a lot more knowledge and expanded our knowledge of the risk factors.
That's a great background for everybody, Angela. Thank you very much for that. Can you then tell us a bit about the integrated approach to workplace mental health and how psychosocial risk assessment fits into that?
Yeah, so I've spoken about that for years now. It came out in 2014, the approach, again, led by my colleague, Tony LaMontagne, and that's a three-pronged or sort of three-pillar approach to workplace mental health. And the first one, obviously the duty of care one, is prevent harm. And that picks up where psychosocial risk assessment and control fits, because you're preventing potential sources of harm to people's mental health. For people who aren't familiar with the integrated approach, besides prevent harm, it also includes promote the positive. So thinking about, good work, positive work design, having a job is good for us, being in an organisation where the environment is supportive and people are interested in their work, get meaning from their work, that promotes mental health, and it can help to buffer against some of those sources of stress that we may not be able to fully eliminate in our work. And then the other side of it, the big side, where all the focus is last 5 or 10 years, is on what should an employer do to support an employee that has a mental health issue. And that can go in a whole range of directions, around reasonable job accommodations, managing absences, managing return to work, a whole heap of things around getting people to the right kinds of treatment, just helping to facilitate that. And so that's what the integrated approach is. But tonight we're just focusing on prevent harm, which, as I said, is so important.
Yeah, you're right, Angela. You know, we like to talk about the preventative things that we can do in the workplace. Most workplaces are very familiar with the mitigate illness end, so EAP, mental health first aid, return to work. More are doing the wellbeing type activities up the top end, and hopefully some are, you know, looking at things like Sharon Parker's research around good work design and whatnot, and designing roles from the outset to have, you know, positive aspects that support mental health and wellbeing. But the missing piece, and that's why I think we're building such a great community around here around psychological health and safety, is this bit around the risk management. And risk assessment is obviously a key component of risk management. Now, Adam, the first part of your PhD has involved a review. I guess you've probably seen more risk assessments than you care to ever see again in your life. So it'd be great to hear from you, maybe a summary of, you know, some of the tools. I see in the chat here that some people have asked, you know, for thoughts on people at work. I don't know if we'll talk about any tools specifically. You may, if you want to. Joelle and I definitely won't, because we have a conflict of interest here. But happy for you to talk to your research and what you found with the tools that you've investigated.
Yeah, definitely. I think given we are hoping to submit a paper to the journal very soon, I probably won't get into you know, the tools themselves, but happy to give obviously some findings. So I think where I'd want to start is, as you said, there is a lot of tools out there. But one thing really I want to call out is they're very difficult to locate. It took months to find the list of risk assessment tools that we have now. And that's for a few reasons. So when we say tools, I just really want to define what we mean. That's psychometric scales, surveys, or questionnaires, really, for the most part. But as we started to do the scoping review, we really found that you know, tool seems to be used for quite a number of applications. So it seems to be synonymous in some places for brochures, guidelines, toolkits, templates, and things like that. But for me, I think that's where it can kind of muddy the waters a little bit, because putting my industry hat on and looking at some of these guidelines that were called tools, they're very lengthy documents, you know, hundreds of pages long. And I'm sure there's absolutely amazing content in there, but I just think from a workplace perspective, if I think about my time as a manager, I didn't have enough time to get my own job done, let alone sit down and review these lengthy documents, you know, and I imagine the same would be true of people in the HR space, etc. So that's one thing I want to acknowledge, is we need to probably get a little bit clearer around what we mean by tools, because you know, people are probably looking for practical risk assessment tools and instead finding guidelines. And also in terms of language as well, I think, you know, tools can come in a number of different forms. You can have things like an index or an inventory or a barometer. And these are things that I found along the way, you know, that if you're outside of the research space, you may not know that that's actually a tool. So, you know, you can get really lost in all of that, which is why I think so many people rely on the same risk assessment tools, you know. So another thing I just want to map out is, again, around the language. So since the 1960s, there's been quite a big change in how we talk about these assessments. They used to be job stress assessments, then they changed to job stresses. And it was around about the 1980s that we started to see a transition to what we see now, which is an assessment of psychosocial hazards. So, you know, even in there's been quite a big transformation, which can kind of confuse people, I think, as you go. But in terms of the tools that we found, a lot of the tools are really designed for that prevent harm space. So, you know, we found around 94% of the tools included in the paper, you know, are primarily under that banner of prevent harm. A lot of those tools are for psychosocial risk assessment, so one would assume that it would obviously cover that domain. But ultimately, you know, according to the integrated approach, the best and most comprehensive approach will bring in promote the positive. It will bring in manage illness. That's how you get the most comprehensive coverage to understand, is my business got a strategy aligned to all levels, because when all of those factors are working together, you'll have the most comprehensive tool. And we only found out of the 98 tools that are included in this paper, there's only 4 that we would say align with the integrated approach. Now, we are going to talk to Tony next week and get his thoughts, because, you know, this is probably his baby, really. But that's really what we found, is that a lot of these tools are really aimed at that prevent harm piece, which is probably good for some people, given, you know, most of our OH&S law really is focused on that, you know, that prevent harm space anyways.
Yeah, 98. I can't believe that. Yeah, I was talking to you about this previously. I didn't realise it was 98. That's quite a few journal articles, as Joel would say.
Yeah.
It's an easy way to get published. You know, develop and validate a survey in the.
Indeed. Yep.
Yeah. So and I guess you get then citations as well when people.
You do. Yeah. I used to work in safety culture, and the number of safety culture assessments out there is just mind-boggling. So.
Yeah. Yep. So that kind of brings in. It's a good segue into the next question I had for you around the development of these. You know, they can be developed by academics. They can be developed by industry as well. And of the 98 that were reviewed, did you notice that there was any difference between, you know, how they were developed, who they were developed by, and their applicability based on how it was developed?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's probably one of the key findings here. So most of the tools do come out of research, and some of the tools like that I'd be happy to mention just because they're used in so many applications. So you've got the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire and the Job Content Questionnaire. And you could find, you know, an abundance of papers online where they've been validated in a number of countries and a lot of different cultures, which is great. So, you know, those tools are very psychometrically tested, is what we'd call, and I'll define that a bit more shortly. But then when we look at tools created by industry, and I'd probably define industry here as not-for-profits or government agencies like SafeWork, we found that actually a lot of those tools, actually, you know, we could say all of those tools had no psychometric testing. And this is consistent with a study that was done out of Monash in 2019 of recovery at work tools, where they looked at tools published through scientific literature and unpublished tools that came through grey literature, is what we call it. And none of those tools in that study had been psychometrically tested either. So seems to almost be a trade-off in a way, you know, in that industry is creating tools out of necessity, you know, probably because they're very hard to find or they have a very niche market, yet they're not being psychometrically tested. And just to kind of take a step back, so for those of you who don't know, psychometric analysis, you know, really focuses on two questions. The first is, how reliable is an instrument? So that is, you know, does an instrument produce consistent measurement results? And secondly, how valid is an instrument? So, you know, is it doing what it's designed to do? So what I'm saying there is industry tools don't seem to be psychometrically tested. So although there's great intent behind these tools, they are being created out of necessity. Are they doing what they're intended to do? Well, we don't know until we actually do that testing. But I think really the big finding for me there is we need research and practice to come together and collaborate. You know, so there's some good examples. The people that work for, and I can see there's a question here about that, is a good example of where you see research and practice coming together. You've got, you know, decision makers who are providing funding to make this tool readily available for workplaces. So there's a good example of what we can do to make these tools robust from a psychometric perspective, but also, you know, available where, you know, there seems to be a trade-off sometimes where research tools are harder to locate because they may be included in an academic paper, and sometimes academic papers are hidden behind paywalls. So there is a trade-off there between the tools created in research and those created in industry.
Yeah, some of the other problems I've encountered when looking at psychosocial risk assessments is some of them are protected by copyright. So even if you can find them in a journal article somewhere, if you were to use them, you know, they might cost $10 or $15 per person who responds to the questionnaire. So they can be quite costly to conduct a survey if you're paying $15 per response, as well as your own employees' time, obviously, to complete the survey.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
One of the other issues that I guess I've seen is when working with academics, and this is not directed at you, Angela, but when working with academics, when they're really trying to get high reliability and validity, often there's a trade-off between we need lots of questions then to make sure that we are covering this construct appropriately, and therefore you have very long survey batteries versus something.
That's why they call it a battery. Yeah.
It is.
From the participants' point of view, they do feel a bit battered by the end of it all.
Yeah, it is some form of torture, that's for sure, a lot of these surveys. So you have these ones, and yeah, they're more rigorous, but they take more time, which then drops engagement, which means that maybe you don't get as many people participating, which doesn't give you as good a reflection on, you know, on what is the current state of play, if you like. Versus what companies want. If you're going to sell this to operations and you're saying, oh, this is going to take 30 minutes or longer for people to complete, then there can be a lot of pushback, and then no psych risk assessment is done. So how did you go when evaluating the different tools that are available, and you know how long they were versus that reliability and validity that's so important?
Was that question aimed at me, sorry, or Ange?
Well, Angela seems to be on fire at the moment, so Angela.
Yes, obviously survey length is, you know, and, you know, when you're dealing with people's questions about surveys that haven't, you know, had the training and all this stuff that Adam's talking about with psychometrics and things like that, they'd be like, well, why have you asked me basically the same question 4 times? And that's because we need to have inter item reliability and cover off, you know, variations of content on a factor and how that might look to people. So, you know, it's a common frustration. It's a frustration for people that are filling out the surveys as well as for the researchers, because, you know, we want to get good response rates, and so it really is always a trade-off. Quite often when I'm doing my practical private work that's outside of the university setting via Pracademia, we have to make changes to surveys. You know, we might consider a whole range of different measures, and we get input from people in the organisation about, you know, what the priorities are, because they say, well, you can have a maximum of 15-minute survey administration time, and you are having to make trade-offs between some of these, you know, well-studied instruments versus, you know, we're going to have to only include 2 items out of that 6-item scale because we haven't got space, but we don't want to lose covering that construct. So it's not perfect in an academic sense, but it's practical for the client. It still gives them information that they need, and, you know, everything is about the trade-off. And the other thing about using tools that come off the shelf, and that means it has to be done with these instructions and the questions have to be asked with this response scale. You know, it can be problematic to university researchers to tinker around with their scales and measures, but at the end of the day, my primary concern is that you've got something reasonably valid and it's going to give you the information that you need. So, yeah, it is really always a trade-off.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we have to, you know, make sure people understand it is important to have that reliability and validity, but at the end of the day, if you're actually going to be able to do a psychosocial risk assessment, you do need to realise the needs of operations as well.
Absolutely, or if it doesn't get done, you're not moving forward, you're not doing anything. So I'm not a purist, and obviously that's why I've ended up doing private consulting work as well, because I think it's better to, you know, to get started than to be paralysed for 2 years by looking at 98 measures that Adam's found. But having said that, you know, I think if, you know, regulators are recommending particular surveys, you know there's been some behind looking into it. And the other thing is there is not one single tool that's perfect, that covers everything, because all workplaces are different. And, you know, you have these, I know I saw you, Joelle, posted something about generic global risks that everybody in every job will be exposed to. And then there's a whole heap of industry-specific, occupation-specific things. So even, you know, some of our most robust tools that have been studied well aren't always going to be completely appropriate for the job. So another thing I do is always, when I'm doing private work, do quite a bit of consultation first, so that we can tailor it to that industry and occupation and what the client wants to know.
So
yeah, I'd say, oh, sorry to cut you off, Joel. I was just going to say it's, during that first paper, one of the things we did is we created an expert panel to kind of inform what tools were out there and kind of give us some resources that we could look at. And I just remember one specific example of a really experienced, you know, work health and safety rep who was chatting to me about their psychosocial risk operations and how they had to use 2 different measures because they weren't fit for purpose, because this was quite a big business with a lot of different demographics and different sites. And even though they were using two big measures, they still had to spend about 3 hours each time prepping to make it suitable. And I could just see the look on this person's face, just saying like, please help me. Is there a better measure out there? And I was like, I'll let you know if I find one. But it was clear that even, you know, these experienced practitioners, it's so hard to find a decent measure that is adaptable to their business. And they really do have to spend all this time, which you think, they're time poor as it is. They you know, want to be out there consulting with the staff more so than having to do all this planning work. So, you know, can we alleviate some of those pains for them? So hopefully the tools we found somewhere in there'll be something that will help people along the way, I think.
Yeah, so to build on that point, Adam, obviously we haven't seen 98 of them, but the tools that we've seen tend to be along the perception survey approach, where you'll, you know, define a work factor. You'll ask a number of questions to establish what the different, you know, to make sure that you're capturing the entirety of that particular factor, and then you've got a bunch of different work factors that you're exploring within that survey and getting people's perceptions about the presence or absence or degree to which they experience that particular factor. And then sometimes these perception surveys refer to themselves as risk assessments. Is that an accurate term for what they're actually doing?
I think that's a really good point. You know, the first thing I'd want to say is part of what we were looking for with these tools was, are they designed evaluatively or descriptively? And so from an evaluative perspective, that would be an employee's psychological evaluation of a psychosocial hazard as opposed to the existence of it. And most of the tools we found were really aligned to those psychological evaluations. And of course, that's important because, you know, we want to understand how staff feel about these various hazards and maybe the measures we're taking to deal with them. But at the same token, you know, there's not a lot of these perception surveys that are designed descriptively to understand what is, you know, happening in workplaces or the existence of a strategy to deal with a stressor. And, you know, that's what I really liked in the 45,003 psychosocial course that you guys had, was it really did talk to that frequency, duration, and severity of a stressor. Because, as you said, Joelle, you know, the presence of something doesn't necessarily mean it's a risk. It's understanding that, you know, in the context of those things like frequency and severity. And once you understand that, you know, you'll understand whether it's a risk to your business. I'd say a lot of the measures that we found really do seem to follow the same, you know, pathway, which is really to understand how the employee feels about it. And, you know, again, it's like I never want to say that data is not valid, but it's just, can we get a balance of understanding? Because I think until we get different data inputs, you know, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later with the key informant stuff, you know, we might not have the full picture and really understand whether that is truly a risk to our business.
I just want to address something from the comments here. So someone was asking about, you know, do you need surveys as part of a psychosocial risk assessment? And the answer is no, right? If you've got a small enough work group, you can, you know, talk to them about how work is. And if a line manager with the support of HR, OD, health and safety can kind of frame the discussion around psych factors like workload and autonomy and role clarity and support and these sorts of things that we know are important for wellbeing in the workplace, then absolutely you could, you know, do that just by a conversation. The reason we go to surveys and the reason the discussion today is on surveys is more about scalability. So if you are going to a large population in a large organisation, for example, the most time-effective way to do your risk assessment is to do that via a survey. As Adam was saying, with a lot of the perception surveys, though, there are you'll find out whether factors are present, or you'll get an example of the design of work. So workload is high, or control is low. But then we can make assumptions about risk, right? We can say, well, workload's high, autonomy is low. That means that there is a risk here, and that means that we should mitigate that risk. The problem is when we make these assumptions, they might not necessarily be the case, because we're not taking into account people's preferences for what they do at work or how they work. I'm sure the listeners today, many of you would know people who love to be flat out busy all the time. That energizes them. It's actually not a stressor for them. Some people want to check their brain at the door. They don't want to have to think when they come into work, and they select into roles like that. So lack of control or lack of autonomy is actually not going to be a psychosocial hazard for them. But there's this assumption made. And so typically, to find out whether the results of the survey are demonstrating a risk or not, we have to follow that up with further consultation, right? So we use the survey data to inform a conversation with staff, going, hey, these are some of the key factors that came out of the survey. Let's discuss why workload's high. What are the things that are, maybe making us more efficient or having to spend more time doing things that we are. But you go through all the factors, and then you have to kind of get people based on gut feel to go, well, what do we feel are actually the biggest risks in terms of stresses and might cause, psychological injury if we don't mitigate them. So even though a survey is designed to do psychosocial risk assessment at scale, often with the follow-up work that's required, it can be quite time-intensive to get to that understanding of risk. So if anyone yet has, and I'll put a link up to it at the end of the episode today, but if anyone hasn't checked out our training on ISO 45000 or the www.45003.org website, then that might be something to look at in terms of extrapolating on that idea. Sorry, Angela.
Oh, I just wanted to say the flow on as well from having the big survey and the results, if it is a large workforce that you're dealing with, it can help you to break down different types of employees as well, to make sure that you're looking at how the risks affect people, with different demographics. Maybe they are not from a primarily English-speaking background, or looking at how women and men and, all sorts of other occupational roles that people do, are they, what kind of work are they actually doing? It enables you to be able to split data and compare and look in different areas of your business. And the next step from that too means that you may have different strategies for control depending on the different areas of the business, because you've got to keep in mind that it's about what's reasonably practicable to do in response to the results. And that might look different in this part of the business compared to this part of the business. So yeah, it's not the be all and end all, just doing the survey. In fact, doing the survey and not doing the controls properly is very demoralizing for employees, and you'd be better off not starting, because you get that fatigue of surveys and nothing ever changes and nobody did anything with the results,
Yeah, I was just having that conversation with this client before, where they're saying, oh, we're slammed at the moment, and we don't know if we'd be able to fit in the risk assessment. And I'm like, well, if you can't fit in the risk assessment, definitely don't do it, because you won't have time to implement any controls.
Yeah.
And that will be the worst thing, right? Yeah, we've heard you, but we're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, so don't do it.
And I think that's why employee engagement surveys often get a bad rap, right? Like, we do them at a global level. Like you're saying, Angela, the results aren't often fed back at a work group level. It's done at the whole of organisation level. And then the controls are decided at a whole of organisation level by management, rather than getting down to the work group and doing that next level of consultation with staff to go, all right, let's unpack this a bit further and let's work together to work out what are the controls that are actually going to make work not suck.
Yeah.
So
you need but it's very appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to do the whole cycle. So as you're saying, Angela, if you don't have time to do the risk assessment, definitely don't rush. Try and fit it in. You need to make sure you also have time for the resultant discussions, and then time to implement controls as well. Yeah.
I can see a question as well, just about some of the studies that I mentioned a bit earlier on. And I'm very happy to provide links and things via LinkedIn or contact me, and happy to provide those studies.
Yeah, at the for the people who've registered via LinkedIn to attend today's webinar, then we will be providing a follow-up email with links to connect with each of us via LinkedIn. So please feel free to reach out to Angela, as she said. We will be releasing this as a podcast episode as well on Monday, and in the show notes we can drop a bunch of those links in as well that Angela will hopefully provide to us. So make a note of that. Now, one of the things that we've observed is some companies they like the idea of collecting data so much that they jump straight into the risk assessment process and run a big survey without thinking about maybe some of the steps they might have to do before doing the survey. So I think practically for the listeners today, it might be worthwhile talking about what some of those steps a company might consider doing in terms of a comm strategy or buy-in or policy or procedure kind of work before you run in and start doing a survey.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'd encourage, and I know Marianne Baton's talked about this a little bit, but people to look at the Guarding Minds at Work resource out of Canada, because there's a specific component there that talks about the concept of rushing to survey. And, you know, I think what's so good about that resource is that it's really focused and aligned to that plan part of the PDCA, you know, in the 45,003. And, you know, it's no, you know, it's like the fact that there's 4 clauses of the 45,003 in that plan domain is because you really need to spend time planning. And some of the things that could involve is, you know, am I using the right tool? I saw a question there saying, you know, a number of survey instruments is 7 to 12 questions. Is this enough? Well, really it comes down to, you know, is it fit for your business? Because there probably are so many, you know, surveys out there, maybe because people are trying to get citations on one hand, but at the other hand, there's probably a necessity of new surveys being developed. So you need to find the right tool for your business. Secondly, I think it's, you know, is my workplace ready? And I keep thinking about things, you know, which would be more common with COVID around, you know, redundancies and people losing work. And the people that are left over, you know, there's a concept called survivor syndrome, and that's where people stop displaying organizational citizenship behaviors and they start to really go into self-preservation mode because they're thinking, I've just watched my colleagues lose their job. I just want to do everything I can to keep my job. So they start to move away, you know, from wanting to do these surveys. And I would almost question as well, you know, are those people in the right headspace to answer these questions? You know, there's been research that have shown that people with depression are more likely to answer these surveys negatively. So, you know, we've got to keep in mind this introduces response bias. So if you want to avoid things like response bias and you know, not getting, you know, data that's accurate, we really need to make sure the workplace is ready because, you know, if you're going to deploy a survey upon a big business, it's going to take a lot of time out of your business. It's going to cost a lot of money. I think some of the other factors too is really around the level of literacy. So I'm working on a project at the moment and we really are, you know, I'm seeing people really want to rush to that. Okay, what solution mode? And I said, we haven't even looked at the level of literacy across this business. We need to understand who the early adopters of this change are going to be because they'll be the champions that can help. But we also need to understand who the laggards are that we're going to have to convince with more data or you know, various initiatives there. So I think, you know, it may sound like a lot of work, but you've just got to consider the trade-offs. If you just dump a survey in there, it's the wrong survey, your workplace isn't ready, you know, you are probably fatiguing your workplace unnecessarily. You really need to do that plan work. That is why it's so key to that plan, you know, part of the PDCA.
To build on that, Madam, I think the 45,003, you know, it sort of lays out that approach to integration into your safety management system. And it does sort of step through all of those things that you need to do before you get to the point where you actually start to engage employees and ask them about what the hazards are. So there's a whole lot of work in the front end, you know, from a policy perspective, from a, you know, leadership communication and commitment perspective, you know, integrating this language into your systems, into your procedures, all of that kind of stuff, not to mention the competence that's necessary across, you know, across the organisation, going you know, literacy is important. But when you look at the cross section of functions that actually need to have a good level of competence in understanding mental health, understanding the implications of mental health for their function, and then line managers as well, understanding actually how to manage a team, you know, with a normal population distribution of varying levels of mental health. You know, it is a big endeavour before you get to the point where you, as an organisation, you are ready to measure.
Yeah.
Just want to say to board level leadership support, like again, as part of that planning, you know, the thing is you've got to think ahead, think a few steps ahead, because if you get the results and you know, wanted to genuinely involve employees in helping to plan the controls, you got to know, are some controls off limits? Or, you know, the big one is always resources. The workload is too high for the resources that we have to deliver it. And if you know, the senior leaders of the company are not prepared to look at resources, then, you know, sort of knowing that, like I said, and then not acting on that could actually, you know, sort of increase cynicism and the sort of negative beliefs and things that can actually then put you at risk for depression, because you think your work place isn't treating you fairly and all that organisational justice stuff. So if you haven't sort of thought ahead as to the potential strategies that you might have to put in place when you get this information, you know, again, it really could be a bit of a disaster. So I know everyone always mentions leadership support, but that's a bit generic. To me, it means leadership appetite for taking on the control strategies that might be needed.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, right, with leadership support. You know, it's all well and good to say, oh, mental health is important, and here I am with a lived experience of mental illness. That's not leadership support. You know, embedding it in your policy and saying we are committed to periodically doing a psychosocial risk assessment, rather than waiting for people to let us know that they're not doing well because work's let them down. We're going to ask them, how is work? You know, and how can we work together to improve your working conditions? Have a commitment in your policy for that. And then it's not going to just be a one-off activity. It is going to be something that's resourced and is done as a continuous improvement initiative rather than as a once-off.
Just
so
like sales, you know, and customer feedback, they're continual processes that are fundamental to how the business operates. And so this shouldn't really be any different.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? So if it's ingrained in policy and employees are aware, this isn't just going to be something we do once, and we're just going to identify everything now that needs to improve. And if we don't identify it now and address it in this round, it's never going to happen. So like you're saying, Angela, like, you know, there'll be some things that are off limits that we just cannot either afford to do practically, or it's just too big a task for us to tackle right now with everything else that's a requirement at the moment as a business. So a good example of that, I was talking to a client recently, and they knew the IT system or a particular IT system they were using sucked. It was such a cause of grief for people. But to change that would have been a massive project that would probably take a year or two to undertake. Now, we're not suggesting that, you know, employers need to commit to taking action to do that, but you have to understand if that's likely to come up, then you have to then at least be willing to make a commitment that you're going to investigate that further. Rather than just saying, oh, we can't ever deal with that. Because like you say, then you have these problems with organisational justice and all the rest that come out of that, like, and lack of control and everything else.
Yeah.
Probably doing more harm than good. So I think as an outcome, even letting employees know you will investigate it further, and it won't maybe happen in this round because we want to look at the low-hanging fruit this round, but we'll investigate it further and, you know, address some of those things the next time around, or do some work in the background so we're maybe more ready next time we do the risk assessment. Then employees are going to buy more into the process, I think.
Yeah, and you're building trust by being transparent was the other thing of, you know, that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even if the response to employees is, look, we understand what you're saying, but there's nothing that we can do about it right now, it's still better than not saying anything about it at all.
Yeah.
You're still acknowledging what they've said, and you're potentially giving some reasons as to why, you know, whatever it is isn't possible. And they might not like it very much, but it's better than just being ignored.
Yeah.
Adam, sorry,
go.
Jason. I just saw a question there, and it's quite a big one, so I thought I'd maybe jump on that one. It was just, do any of the tools refer to exposure to occupational violence? I work in government, and our staff are abused, threatened, and assaulted, which is really sad to hear. And I can imagine it would not be easy being a frontline worker during COVID. But yeah, in answer to that question, we were specifically focusing on work environment tools that were really looking at those global hazards. But what we did find, because although we've included 98 tools in our paper, we found a total of 206 tools. So there's been a lot of tools we found, and some of them are very specific to things like occupational violence or negative acts, as they'll be called in some of these survey batteries. And other things like workplace bullying. And that's one of the things we found. There are some measures that are very specific. So in a way, you could almost deploy like a global measure that looks at all of the different hazards in your workplace. And if you find, say, burnout or something like that is a very specific and common issue in your workplace, then you can drill down even further if you need to with these more specific item-focused scales. So yeah, I'm happy to obviously share those as well, because I can imagine they'd be very, very necessary right now, unfortunately.
And People at Work survey does have a violence. Sorry, just for the person who asked about People at Work and for this particular listener, People at Work does include exposure to violence in the workplace. And so some of those ones that are kind of more well-known will cover it.
I think once you've actually had an event, though, you know, if you've had staff being followed home and abused, you know that occupational violence is a problem. You don't need to survey your staff and ask them if it's a problem. You already know. So just get them together and start talking about what on earth you can do to protect them better. Don't waste time doing a survey. Get in and start acting.
That's a very good point.
But Joelle, a survey I did recently with an organisation, when we looked at the results, and it did have a exposure to violence and exposure to bullying and included some frequency and duration stuff, the management team were very shocked to find out things like how often has somebody spat on you and things, you know, they were genuinely unaware. So staff were not reporting some of these incidents, and they're not being sort of logged in a safety incident system or anything like that. So, you know, this was news to the management that, you know, even though it was a small percentage of staff, there was a pocket of people in that in those responses that had had exposure to a whole lot of really very unpleasant behaviours. Yeah,
no, certainly. I wasn't suggesting that people should not ask questions at all.
Yeah, sorry.
You know, if you are getting those incident reports in and you have that information about those hazards that are present already, then just basic duty of care says that you need to act.
And that's probably a good point to make as well, right? So we haven't actually discussed today when to do a psychosocial risk assessment. And obviously it is a good idea to get into a periodic cycle of psychosocial risk assessment. So rather than waiting for reports to come up, you go out periodically and ask, how are we doing and have we improved, and are the controls that we put in last time working, or do we need to consider other controls? But absolutely, if someone is reporting hazards, or someone has developed a psychological injury as a result of exposure, then that would probably be another time to go, hey, look, you know, it's not time yet, but maybe we should, you know, do another survey and find out, is this an isolated incident, or are other people exposed to this hazard as well?
So Adam, you mentioned a term earlier, key informants. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so by key informants, we mean HR workers, work health and safety reps, you know, line managers, people that, you know, would have responsibility or probably more of an understanding around psychosocial hazards. It's quite funny, the timing, because we were talking about this a little bit, Joelle, and then we went to a conference where we actually asked, you know, a lot of people that we'd probably consider key informants, you know, do you perform psychosocial risk assessments? Do you understand some of the key stuff out of Safe Work Australia around the national guidance for psychosocial assessment? And next to nobody answered yes to that. So again, we're running on the assumption that key informants are informed. That being said, I'd probably say somebody in a HR role would be more informed than the general populace. But yeah, really, our research was focusing on, what are the tools designed for key informants? Because a lot of them are designed for employee self-report. If you look over any literature really to do with, job stress surveys or psychosocial risk surveys, they're always talking about employee self-report and some of the drawbacks of this from a bias perspective. But we really wanted to kind of look at as well at understanding, from those that would have more content expertise, as it's kind of described in the integrated approach paper. What are the strategies or the different approaches that workplaces are taking to handle a hazard. We want to gather that information, as well as obviously the psychological evaluation of psychosocial risk factors as well.
It was quite shocking, actually, how little psychosocial risk assessment is getting done, even though there is some sort of obligation. And we were very careful to say it doesn't have to be with a survey or anything, but just tell us about your process for how do you monitor these things. And yeah, it was a bit quiet. And the other thing was, I saw in the Productivity Commission report, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry had done a survey of their members about whether they were even aware of Safe Work Australia's guidelines from 2019, and only 30% had even heard of it. So, there is such a long way to go in this area, I think, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a completely bad news story, because we've got obviously things like your podcast and your lives and a whole lot of other organisations that are out there trying to promote good practice. But yeah, the practice is still pretty thin.
Yeah, we're still waiting on one of the regulators to come and sponsor our lives or our podcast. Or waiting for them to come on as guests. They're waiting to be able to share some news. But yeah, it would be great. They could actually pay us for this, Joe.
Oh, is that what you're getting at?
Just thinking about the commerciality. Yeah.
Classic CEO.
Yeah. Hey, I'm just conscious of time, guys. So how do you feel about some Q&A from some of the questions that have come through?
Yeah,
sure.
Let's go.
Sounds good.
Now, I know this may not be completely related to what we've been discussing, and I can pretty much guess, because I think I got a LinkedIn message, and Joel did as well in the last week about this particular one. But the question is, I'm advocating for a simple 1 to 2 page high-level guide to workplace mental health legislation to lay down the law for the unconverted who operate outside the law. Has anyone seen an example? So this person particularly, I believe, is trying to identify all of the legislation and state-based kind of guides on what companies should be doing around identifying psych hazards and mitigating them. And he's trying to summarize that into a short document, because there's obviously so many different things now, and all the states are coming out with their own codes of practice at the moment as well. So have either of you seen something like that?
Probably not a 1 to 2 page. I mean, I have seen some good distillations of things on websites and stuff about what is the responsibility. But most of them are, 20-page documents and things that are, like you say, put out by either the national body or the state regulators. But I just wanted to mention for this listener that the National Workplace Initiative in Australia is attempting to actually do that. They're trying to solve the problem of the confusion that's out there, the complexity that's out there. Which thing should I do? What's the basic stuff that I've got to do? And so you might want to see if you can get them on the show. Erica Crome is leading that project, just to talk about that simplification and the reduction of the noise that's all been very well-intentioned stuff that's out there. But there is this sort of problem of a bit of paralysis, that some decision fatigue and this kind of thing, which stops people getting started. So I think it's a good point, that it does need to be simplified. And the other one that I wanted to recommend is maybe some guests for the show too. The New South Wales Safe Work Strategy. I've done some work with them to think about targeting small business, which is, again, needing information in a really simple way that the client and not be, potentially getting into trouble when all the new regulations come online, which is something we haven't talked about either, that, there was this vote with all the ministers in all the state safe work bodies to start regulating. Because at the moment it's a bit of a toothless tiger situation with putting the expectation out there that employers are doing this but not having any, real inspection and regulation around psychosocial issues. Sorry if that was a bit of a long answer.
That's all right. I just want to apologise to all the listeners for the last hour as well. I just realised I've been running, Joelle and I are running off the same mic, and we've been running off the same computer microphone laptop, not these big beautiful microphones that we've got in front of us at the moment. So there were a couple of comments coming through about noise sound, and I just couldn't understand why. But my fault, technical issues. Hopefully you're able to catch some of what Joelle was saying.
This is the second time that this has happened.
And it's always Angela. The last time we used the computer microphone rather than the podcast microphone.
I love how you're saying we there, like it was a joint thing.
I had one job, didn't I? One job.
Well, I hope that you can hear me much better now that we're at the end of the.
You better actually contribute something now to this Q&A. So
thanks.
Now we can hear you.
That's kind of you.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question, maybe Joelle. Now that you got the microphone working.
All right.
So I should ask a question. So how do we differ between psychosocial work-related and non-work-related, or maybe both can impact each other?
I guess it depends what perspective you're coming from. So, if you're somebody who's looking at it from a workers' compensation perspective, then probably an incredibly relevant question, and one that I'm probably not best place to answer, seeing as that's not my background. Jason talked earlier about, stress being cumulative. There's a big role for employers to play in supporting employees who are having a hard time. If that hard time is coming from outside of work, then, it's about having a conversation with that worker about what supports you can provide, what accommodations can be made so that they can remain at work, maybe not in the same capacity as they would normally be, but so that they can still remain in the workforce, because we know that that's a protective factor for mental health. And we know that the longer people are outside of work, once they've suffered a psychological injury, the longer it takes for them to get back into work again, and the longer and more expensive and more challenging their rehabilitation is. So regardless of the source of that psychological distress, I would say that the number one thing is to have an honest and open conversation with the employee about what they need and what can you reasonably provide as a business. As a line manager, it's about understanding what options are available to you within the business, and from functional owners, for example, human resources, safety, whoever it might be who actually has ownership of those policies and procedures. It's about building in sufficient flexibility so that those line managers have a number of different options that they can explore with the employee to come to a solution that's going to best suit them. And obviously, if the issues are work-related, then you need to explore those in more detail and look at how you can, if not eliminate them, then reduce the exposure to the employee to those hazards. So there's lots of different issues, I guess, that you can explore there, and the solutions are ultimately going to depend on what the source of the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely agree, because that's why the integrated approach was trying to bring the different threads together to help, to say the prevent harm is the work-related factors. You can't prevent the harm in the person's life outside of work, but you can help respond to those stresses that they might be experiencing outside of work, but through support and other options that Joelle has mentioned. But they do interact. So the question is, based on a good premise, yes, the personal psychosocial factors, going back to how, someone was raised in their childhood and what their socioeconomic situation, whole range of other factors that could be creating a lot of distress in the person, and they don't separate that out because, as you say, Jason, it's interactive, cumulative. So yeah, I think that was a good response, Joelle.
Thank you.
Yeah. One of the other things that we don't often talk about is the interaction between different workplace-related factors either, right? Often, and Adam might want to talk to this, often when we do psychosocial risk assessments, we're looking at the risk imposed or created by a specific hazard without looking at how multiple hazards together interact towards total risk. Do you have anything to say to that, Adam?
I think that's a really good point, and if we look at theory, for example, Richard Karasek and colleagues had that theory really focused on, control being a buffer for things like, high job demands. And, then that was built on further looking at social support and how that can be a buffer. And that was what we found, really looking at a lot of the scale items for these different tools, which was a very long process. But what it really showed was that, these things can be, there's no hard and fast definition for what social support looks like and what best practice is. And that was the thing that we found, really trying to align a scale, to the integrated approach. It was like, oh, so what exactly are we looking for here? Because there will be so much relation between these and how they interact. So that's something to always consider as well. Just by virtue of having, something like high job demands doesn't mean you don't have the buffers there. You need to understand, okay, is social support enough to mediate that? What other factors can play a role there? Can somebody have high job demands, but they, have control of their workload, and when they do it, so it's absolutely fine. They work really well with that. So you do need to look at all these different factors, because I think, to Joelle's point earlier, you can't just say, oh, this is a risk just by virtue of being a psychosocial hazard. You need to understand the broader context of the organization you're looking at, because maybe it's not an issue at all. I think that's a really important factor.
Yeah, Joelle had a good rant on LinkedIn actually about something similar to this. Someone was mentioning how these grads were being forced to work 130-hour weeks and crazy stuff like that. And someone came on and said, oh, I know a lot of business owners that, will work 130-hour weeks like gladly. But it comes down to the whole idea of control.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many factors, and just look at all the really big theories, effort, reward, and balance and things. It's always an interplay almost, and some of these theories have been built on or made redundant over the years, but, they really are talking to that interplay between different factors, and that's what introduces risk into your business.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'd like to maybe switch up a little bit and bring up another question. So this was from another listener. Are OHS reps adequately qualified to use a guide to complete an assessment rather than referring off to a professional? So, do we need a professional, as in an org psych or an academic or someone like that, to come in and do a risk assessment? Can anyone potentially be trained to be able to do this in-house?
The only situation where I'd say you need to think about who's doing assessments is if you're actually asking people about their mental health status. Then I think you've got some duty of care issues that might be best handled by a psychologist. But the actual assessing factors in the work environment, that is an occupational health and safety job. I don't know the rep, in this situation, how much training and background they've had. It's obviously always good to ensure that people doing any kind of assessments in the workplace have had enough training to, implement them in a professional and, systematic way. But there's no reason an OH&S rep isn't a critical part of actually identifying risks and thinking about controls. So to me, it's when you start to go into the territory of assessing people's, maybe some of those things like financial stresses or personal factors that are outside of the workplace, then, you know, I would say you would really want to be looking at duty of care issues with a psychologist. If somebody's going to come back with a DAS, depression, anxiety and stress score that's off the charts, you need a protocol in place to respond somehow without, you know, violating somebody's confidentiality. So I think the answer to that is it depends on what's in the assessment. But yeah, I think OH&S reps have good knowledge of what the risks in the workplace are.
I think to add to that, you need to think about what the I guess what the duties are of a health and safety representative through the legislation, what they're empowered to do, and I think where the limits are that you can reasonably expect a representative to act, and that's really, you know, they're there to represent their work group, their designated work group. So, you know, you would hope that you've got representatives who have a good understanding of the experiences of their work group members, and they're in a position to advocate for those work group members to escalate to management. These are the hazards that we're experiencing as a work group. But I think you probably wouldn't want to be asking reps to do like a global survey. You'd want to be asking them to focus on their work group specifically.
I think. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, you know, things like the standard will certainly help streamline that. And there seems to be more of a movement towards, you know, upskilling OH&S professionals. You know, Victoria, it looks like there's an inspectorate really focused on, you know, on psychosocial risks in particular. So I think there is an acknowledgement that, you know, maybe there is some work needed there and positive movement. Sorry for cutting you off, Jason.
No, that's fine. Actually, this is a really good question from Bart, which I'll put straight up from YouTube. Do we need our assessment tools to differ from ongoing monitoring tools? A separate survey for ensuring that buffers are effective. I've got some thoughts on this, but I'll let someone else jump in first.
I want to say if you go into embedding this as just a feedback channel, you know, that's more routine, you can probably move to shorter pulse type surveys more regularly than just a big one every 3 years. But Jason, you probably go next.
Yeah, one of the things I hate when talking to companies about risk assessment is when they say, oh, we run an annual employee engagement survey. Why don't we just use that? Because we have some overlap. You know, we ask about workload and control and job satisfaction and that sort of thing. We'll just use that. And I'm like, well, it depends. Do you want to wait a year to work out if your controls are effective or not? You know, a lot can happen in a year, as we've seen in the last 12 months, right? And, you know, if you're only responding once a year to the risks in your organization, there's a lot of potential harm that can occur in that period of time. So I think we do need to think about, as you say, Angela, either pulse type surveys or other style of, you know, check-ins that can be done more frequently at a greater cadence in order to get that monitoring done. But I definitely don't think you need a big people at work style 30-minute survey, you know, once a month for monitoring. You might do that larger survey every 6 to 12 months based on how quickly you are actually implementing controls to address the identified risks from the assessment. But yeah, definitely other ones. And again, you might want to check out our training on the 45,003 Academy on psychosocial risk assessment. And we talk about a wellbeing tool that we've created, a wellbeing check-in, which only takes 30 to 60 seconds. Now, even though it only takes 30 to 60 seconds, we've had some clients then say, oh, that's great. We could run this once a week and get even better data coming through. And I'm like, well, to our point that we're talking about before, Angela, are you going to actually do something once a week based on the feedback that you've received? Or are you just going to bother people once a week and not do anything with the feedback they're giving you? So they feel like there is no control and there is no justice in the workplace. So even though, yes, I do advocate for pulse style or check-in style surveys to monitor hazards quickly and get a better cadence on that rather than having to wait 6 to 12 months, only go at a cadence where you are able to respond in a quick enough fashion to the feedback.
I would add to that, there's lots of different options that you can use for monitoring as well beyond employee engagement. You know, yes, that's an important aspect of it, but we also want to avoid, you know, mono-method bias. We want to use multiple sources of information wherever we can. So think about the other metrics that you do gather within your organization, you know, your HR data, for example, your incident report data, all kinds of information that you just normally gather through other functions. All of those can also be useful methods of monitoring.
Yep,
And
I agree. You don't want the actual risk assessment to become a psychosocial hazard, do you? You know, I feel like that's what could happen if you do one of these big surveys every 5 minutes. You know, don't do it.
Yeah, battery, as Angela called it earlier. Yeah, it's some form of torture.
That's a very sad insider joke, isn't it? But I love it, Adam.
Yeah, it is.
Here's another good question. Are generic assessment docs with recommended control measures available? So something to do, obviously, following a risk assessment is to think about what are the controls that could address this risk.
Yeah, People at Work's got some really good handy tables in their guidance document that people can find that freely available online. And it has, you know, a table with suggested ways that, you know, low job control might manifest, and then suggested ways of addressing that. And also remember the hierarchy of controls that applies to physical safety. There are versions, you know, quite similar with psychosocial safety, climate, and things like that, that look at the types of control measures to consider as well. So good sources of information that's free. The People at Work, Adam mentioned Guarding Minds at Work out of Canada. They also contain some guidelines for intervention to respond to factors that come up as a concern. That's also freely available. But, you know, that's generic. So you need to, you know, use that in conjunction with consultation, because maybe none of those suggested strategies would work for you, but at least it's a starting point and can be quite helpful to make it more concrete to people.
Yeah, that's an important caveat to add. I think when we spoke with Ian Firth, who had authored or had made a significant contribution to the Code of Practice, he said that they made a deliberate decision not to include sort of control measures in there because they were concerned that people would literally just apply those control measures without putting any more sort of critical thought into it, or, you know, considering whether that was actually the best type of control measure for their particular context. So, yeah, you use them as a guide and to sort of get you thinking in that direction, but definitely, yeah, consult with your employees and work out what's going to be the best solution for your situation.
Funnily enough, Safe Work New South Wales do have a series of guides around psychosocial risks and controls, like common controls. But yeah, to both of your points, it is really important to get down to the nitty gritty and not think a generic control is going to assess it. And probably the example I keep coming back is the one that Dia Day shared with us on our podcast in the early days, when they identified that workload was a significant issue for school principals, funnily enough. And you might think, well, either workload's too big a issue for us to tackle for school principals, they're just going to have to accept it. Or you could go, well, maybe we need to hire more people, or maybe we need to give them less to do, which are both impracticable, you know, solutions to that hazard. But when they investigated it, they realized it was actually an IT system that was causing people the most amount of lost time and grievance and all the rest. And so the control for that workload hazard wasn't anything to do with, oh, let's employ more people or give people less to do or give them less emails or, you know, meetings to attend. It was, let's change the IT system. So, yeah, generic controls, whilst it might give you an idea about what typically could be done to address a hazard, you need to consult. It doesn't. You still need to get to that point and go, well, practically, you know, in our group, what's going to actually address our hazard? Yeah.
I think on that as well, like if you look at the Guarding Minds at Work resource, and I say resource rather than survey there, because it's, if you hop on there and look at it, there's so many different component parts to it, as we said, from the rushing to survey, making sure your environment's prepared, like just to jump to control. And, you know, I know it would be lovely to have just a list of, here's all the controls you can throw out there. you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to build an informed strategy, to go out to your workplace and say, we've consulted with you here. We've really tried to understand what the pain points are here. These controls have been created off the back of it, as opposed to, if we have a list of controls and we say we've deployed mindfulness measures, okay, where have you taken that from? Well, it's just best practice. We've been told it's best practice. Yeah, but where's that coming from? You want to be able to say to your employees, we consulted with you and we've made an informed approach. So just consider it's really all about strategy here, not just a list of measures, which I'm sure, would be simpler, but I just don't think they're as effective, to be honest.
Yeah. I'm just conscious of time, so this will be the last question from the Q&A. Thanks to everyone who has submitted a question, and make sure you tune in next month and you'll be able to ask more questions if you have any. But I think this one is actually a very good practical one to finish us off. So when planning survey rollout, should you pilot in an area of the business where there's high trust and perhaps less opportunity to make a difference, such as likely to find lower level of risk? So pilot first before doing a full company-wide rollout.
Well, I'd say on that, just thinking about the business that I'm working with at the moment, where again I was talking about the different levels of mental health literacy. In a way, it makes sense to start with the early adopters, right? Because if you're a laggard and you're sitting there thinking, I don't know if this is going to work. I've seen it done before, which happens in a lot of instances, and there's that cynicism. The way to break that cynicism is, show that it works. The laggards aren't just going to want and accept this on the face of it, that, we're trying to make change. They're going to want to see, hey, look, these early adopters are doing it through a pilot. It's working for them. I don't want to be left in the dust. I'm happy to get on board now. So that's just my opinion, but I really do think it makes sense to try and, start with the early adopters, because they're the ones that are going to show, a lived experiences of change, as opposed to, just jumping on those laggards when they might be, cynics, I suppose.
Yes, and I just think you always pilot any survey before you launch it out there on people, and the sort of extent to which you would do that obviously depends on the size of your business and the diversity within your business, because you need to make sure the survey is going to be easily understandable and easy to complete for people across the business. So I often do a small group that's sort of quasi-representative of the types of roles in the organisation, but that's more from a sort of validity of survey administration point of view, and checking it and making sure that it makes sense to people. Here, I think the question is also looking at maybe trying to do the, early wins kind of approach. And if it was a very large business, then it probably does make sense to pilot it somewhere where you're not going to get a response rate of 5%. But I also wouldn't be trying to do it in a way that's trying to show good results, artificially. So, yeah, it's a hard question, but definitely piloting things before you scale up resources and time investment, is definitely a good idea.
Yeah, now my opinion definitely is that you make big mistakes in small groups. Mistakes in groups if you've got a company of 10,000 plus, for example. But to your point, Angela, I don't think it matters so much, if you find issues within a group. It's more, how do you listen and then respond as part of your action plan, your controls that you implement following the risk assessment. And if other parts of the business say, hey, this isn't like the annual employee engagement survey where we do it and we never hear anything back. No, they actually used the results and in a very quick fashion came back to us and involved us in further consultation to work out, hey, we've identified the key issues. What are we going to do to address them together, and then commit to action on what you're going to do in the next 3 to 6 months? Then I think that shows to the rest of the business, hey, this is not something that we have to be worried about around survey fatigue, because it's a different approach to what we're used to. And it actually is going to lead to meaningful change.
And it will build trust. So it won't be just that high trust area over here. The actual genuine implementation in response to feedback, even if it's negative, is what's going to build a new area of high trust. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't worry about finding issues. Be worried about not doing anything once you found the issues is the bigger problem. Yeah.
I think the other element there is that by piloting with a group where there is already that sort of trust and willingness to engage, it gives you an opportunity to trial your communications and roll out strategy. And so if there are hiccups, if there are bugs, if there's stuff that people just don't understand, if there are messages that aren't landing, you really got a good opportunity to correct that before you go to a full launch. And you don't really want to I'm trying to think of a polite way to phrase it. Mess it up. You don't want to mess it up globally. If you're going to, as Jason said, if you're going to make big mistakes, make them with a small group, and particularly a small group of people who are likely to be forgiving, and they're there sort of on the basis that part of their function is to help inform a better final rollout.
Yeah, and not just a comm strategy, right? Making sure the technology is all working properly, making sure that people can see it's completely confidential when they respond to a survey, and actually share with the group the level of data that's available back to the administrator and how it is completely anonymized and individual results can't be identified. And we're not asking questions around how much mental illness you have. We're really interested in just the perceptions of work factors here. We're not trying to identify and shame or try and push people out of the business. So, yeah, I think there's a number of really good reasons why you pilot, and you really have to think about how you do that, not just rolling out a survey, but think about your whole risk management cycle when you roll out that bit. But Angela, Adam, I'm conscious we've just ticked over the 90-minute mark, and there's a couple of things I need to do to wrap up the session. But thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. I know that both of you are very friendly on LinkedIn, so I'm sure if people want to follow or connect with you on LinkedIn, that you'd be happy for that.
Yep, definitely.
Yep, and we'll definitely via an email, if you did register over LinkedIn, we'll share an email with a link to the video following this, plus direct links to Adam and Angela's LinkedIn profile, so you can connect with them. And in the show notes in the podcast on Monday, we'll have Angela's links to some of the references that she made in today's session as well. Guys, thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye to you now, and there's just a couple of housekeeping items to finish up on. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Joelle, how was that?
Super.
Yeah. No, Angela and Adam are great. Apologies about the audio again, everyone.
Yeah, shame our technician just doesn't know what he's doing.
He needs to be paid more, I think.
Do you think that's it? I'm not sure that that's it.
Workload might be a bit high.
Possibly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, apologies. Hopefully you got most of that. And in any case, Angela and Adam obviously did the heavy lifting. So thank you very much to both of them for that. Just one of the references I made earlier was that we do have some free training available on both the 45,003 standard as well as psychosocial risk assessment, the new course that we've pushed out. So you'll be able to find that at www.45003.org. So as Adam said, he's checked it out. And if Adam thinks it's good, then it must be good.
That's good enough for us.
That's good enough for us. In fact, I think he gave it 10 stars out of 5.
10 out of 5, yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
Yep. And luckily he's not on here to deny any of that.
He's yelling at us in the background, but you're muted, Adam. We can't hear you.
The other thing that I want to mention, if anyone listened to the episode recently with Alicia Pappas, we did let the cat out of the bag that we will be running because these live panels have been so well attended and people love, it looks like, asking the questions live and getting them answered live. We will be trialing a weekly psych health and safety episode. We're going to start that on Tuesday evening, Australian time, which will be British Standard Time morning. On the Tuesday, the 10th of August, will be the first attempt. If you want to see these things continue past the first week, then please make sure you come along. We will send a link to you so that you know how to register, but it'll be through the same Psych Health and Safety LinkedIn podcast page to register for that live event, and we'll stream it again via YouTube. And Alicia, who's the latest addition industry expert to our team, will be sharing the co-hosting duties with Joelle and myself. So we'll be alternating it. So you get a bit of variety because we know that job rotation is good. For
but you get Jason all the time.
There can never be enough Jason. Come on. No, Joelle's sick of me usually after about 9:10 in the morning. So I can't really say that. But so yeah, again, we will be releasing this as a video probably pretty close to immediately after this is finished, and the podcast episode, if you prefer to listen to it, will be available on Monday. And please feel free to connect with all of us and follow the Psych Health and Safety LinkedIn page as well. So thanks to you all, and we'll catch you next time.